and put forth your statement of what you believe of the future of work, but to work in collaboration with a group of equally committed, talented, deep thinkers and policymakers with their own unique perspective and expertise on coming up with something together. So what we're driving toward is a joint statement of the problems in January, and then a joint statement of the solutions in May. And just to keep in mind that the portfolio approach is really meant to make sure that we're able to be all-inclusive of various perspectives, of various types of solutions, various audience, whoever that we think the actor is who ought to adopt different solutions, as well as, as we've said it, some of them are going to be maybe quick, and nothing's quick and easy, but an easier solution, maybe something that's well tested. We just want to scale it. Or some of them are going to be what Governor Granholm termed last time, like a moonshot idea, right? Moonshot solutions. So all of those are on the table. Today's not to talk about those solutions, but just to be mindful and to remind you all that the portfolio approach is meant to take into account everybody's perspective so that we can come up with a cohesive one document that reflects the consensus and the hard work and the grappling together of all these issues. Okay, so that's we're going to start that here now with a goal to coming to a document in January on the problems and challenges. And something that is the views of everybody. So the small group is also meant to make sure that everybody feels heard. After each session, and Amal's going to go into more detail about the segments of the afternoon, but after each session, each group will have a chance to report out so that we're also benefiting from the conversations that are happening in other groups. So, Amal? Yes, exactly. Yeah, we're just also taking a moment because many of you said this was very helpful to remind us of where we're going, the trajectory, and where we are in that process. So we're just going to run through this quickly.
Reverse order or something. Thank you for that, Julie. So I'll just quickly review some of this. I mean, this is I think I have to sit to do this properly. So this part should be familiar to all the commissioners. This is just the basic structure of what the thinking is for the key components of the final report. The interim report would be first drafted and released, I think, for May 1st. That's right. And then a final report due at the end of the year with these three main parts. The first is sort of fact-based, just on what we know about work in California today. The second one would be a description or analysis of the challenges or the scope of the problem that we're focusing on today and hoping to adopt in January. And then the third would be the actual portfolio of recommendations, so that from January on, there's more in-depth conversation in situations like this or settings like this that's focused more on moving towards specific solutions and recommendations from the commission. Okay, so this is also, we covered this last time as well, just a quick refresher of the overall framework of the commission from the beginning in September to where we are now, thinking of these three key stages around awareness. So at the bottom are also the inputs or the types of information that will be, or resources available to the commission. So this awareness stage of the convenings and hearing from experts and learning more about the nature of the problems. Also holding these external commissioner stakeholder conversations, which we'll hear about in a minute, which we had mentioned last time as well. Then this assessment stage we'll probably engage with now to develop this problem statement document. And then there's two key resources that we want to talk a little bit about that I think will be very useful to the work of the commission. We're thinking about two, either you can think of them as centralized repositories or databases. So there's two of these. And the first, I should say, is it's a repository of existing studies on substantive topics that are relevant to the future of work. So this is the existing research, reports, papers, studies, the PDFs that you guys have seen, that you guys get sent, that we've seen many times, the 70 to 80 page PDFs and studies that have been put out by a number of organizations or institutes or other efforts that are similar to this commission. Some of them are more focused on specific industries than others. Others have different angles, and some are broader than others. So there's a huge amount of research that's out there, and there's a huge amount of these resources that should be informing and shaping our understanding of the nature of the problems and potential solutions or recommendations that can come from that. And the second is a database of proposals that we can actually use, or that the commissioners can use to select or choose from in developing their final recommendations. The first I'll say very quickly is this repository of studies. Luckily for us, the state of New Jersey has a task force on the future of work, and in their first year, what they've done is to create a repository of existing studies and research and reports on the future of work. And it's already posted online, and it's very comprehensive and systematically organized. And so what that repository will be a link on the website of the California Future of Work Commission to the New Jersey State Task Force on Future of Work repository of these existing studies. So that link, if it's not posted yet, will go up soon, and it's very easy to find as well. And then I'll quickly describe this second resource, which is we're calling the solutions database. We're also very, very open to new terms if there's anything that's more compelling that jumps out. But this solutions database is essentially, it will be a combination of existing proposals or recommendations that have already been that have come out of some of those previous studies. Usually these end with 8 to 10 recommendations of specific policies or things like that. And so rather than reinventing the wheel, we wanted to centralize all of those and put them in one place so that everyone on the commission can go and see and pull these up, as well as ideas that have come up through this commission itself, through the convenings that we have, and through ideas from commissioners themselves. So whether they were stated directly in the convening, or they can be submitted over email or in other conversations and things like that, things that commissioners here want to submit as, to be considered as possible recommendations in these reports. And so our team will be populating the database with the existing policies and proposals that currently exist. There's New Jersey Task Force on the Future of Work has done a lot of that work already in terms of gathering and compiling the existing recommendations and solutions. So we'll be creating this database with about 125 to 150 of these policy ideas, and then supplementing that with specific ideas that come from California. And just to give you an idea, each one of those will have a description of what the policy proposal is, as well as who the main actors are, what the time frame would be, the people or the places that are impacted by those policies, the scale of that policy, whether it's a moonshot idea, whether it's a near term in the next 1 or 2 years, whether it's something that's a tested and scalable policy that's already in place elsewhere, or whether it's something that would require innovation and would be something new that's being generated here in California. And then if there are any existing examples or models of that specific policy that exists anywhere else. I mentioned that it will populate. So the goal is that we want to have this database populated with the existing proposals by the January convening for the commissioners. And this is, so that's the sort of back end of this database. We'll be inputting all this information, and then the idea then is to be able to output, this is an example of something that could be outputted that's essentially like a potential portfolio of recommendations for the commission. And we can select these based on what's the topic of the day or what we expect to be covering in January and February and March at those convenings. If we want to, rather than having all the commissioners having to go through 150 a compilation of 150 possible proposed solutions, if we know we're going to think about certain topics, that we can pull those and then present them in something that would be a format like this. So you can, this is just to give you an idea of the kind of document you may have in January, February, March convenings to work with. And so you can see that it presents the ideas, which of the specific problems that the commission is identifying are relevant to those ideas, proposals, who are the main actors, and these other dimensions that I had just mentioned as well. like most confusing clicker ever. Okay, and then the timeline, just to revisit this is something we also covered last time as well. Where we are now, we're in December. These are the convenings that we have lined up. I won't go into too much detail, but we can see how each of them combines this expert testimonies and insights from stakeholders, either at the commission, the convenings themselves, or insights from stakeholders that people are bringing and reporting back from their external conversations that they hold. And then you can see it's moving, the outcomes for each of the convenings is moving from defining the problems and getting to a consensus or an agreement on a statement of problems to then developing, proposing, and finalizing recommendations. And then in between, it also explains what tasks are happening in between the convenings. And these, I believe, are tasks for commissioners, right? So we have a lot of tasks that we know we need to do. And these are the tasks that we're expecting for commissioners to be doing in between. So a lot of them are between any of the convenings. There should be stakeholder conversations that commissioners are setting up. And then, reviewing the dimensions and adding to that database, sending us stuff to be added to that as well. Every single time it gets wrong. I should be, if there's only 2 buttons, half the time I should get it in the right direction. I get it wrong every single time. Is this the end of this? Okay, cool. Right. So in terms of the commissioner stakeholder conversations, which has a great ring to it as well. Last time, a few people had talked about ideas of things that they were planning or were beginning to plan. So I was hoping that Roy could talk a little bit. I think you'd mentioned 1 or 2 topics that you're looking at, possibly with Doug, and just give us a sense of where that's at, how you're thinking about it, how you're going about planning it. And this is partly an update, but also to be instructive to other commissioners as well as to get how we can set up conversations like this and what it would look like.
Yeah, and I'd also add, I'd love input and feedback on this because we're obviously all making this up as we go along. So the goal that I had anticipated for the commissioner stakeholder conversations, a lot of syllables, that I proposed was to bring voices into the conversation that might be important to us because they're either unique to California or have some particular bearing on us, and that for one reason or another, the full commission meeting might not be the best way to get value, either because it requires a little bit more depth in order to synthesize or for some other reason. And so the 2 that we had discussed are 1, the military and its role in the future of work, biggest employer in the state of California. And the second is Hollywood as a template for the future of work, but also as a storyteller for the world that could shift the culture around these issues. And Doug and I are collaborating around the Hollywood one. There's obviously an enormous role for organized labor as a template for much of what works about Hollywood. And I'm open to having a collaborator on the military session. We're seeking to have pairs. Let me just talk about the format that I am envisioning and timing and a few other logistics. The format is 2 commissioners, as I think everybody knows from the guidelines we got last time, and a single table, round table conversation with 6 to 12, let's say, experts who represent a variety of different perspectives on the issue. Facilitated by us, the commission members, with a set of questions that we bring to them and share in advance and just try to get their guidance on. And so, for example, in the case of the military, we may have representatives from the California National Guard. We may have representatives from a major military base. We may have folks from the Department of Defense in Washington who understand what the local presence in California looks like. And we might ask questions about everything from, are there employment models in terms of the treatment of workers that the US military employs that might be a template for us? We might ask, are there capacities that various branches of the armed services have to serve our state in the future that we should take into account? We might ask about the geography of economic growth. Base location and selection is obviously an enormous driver. And the idea is to agree on a set of topics. Doug has begun some outreach to organize labor for the Hollywood session, agree on a set of invitees, and then probably not earlier than mid-February, but sort of mid-February to mid-March, hold the meeting. Sort of December is already over. We're already in 2020 roughly as far as planning goes, and so enough time to get the right folks. So that's the high level. Anything else you want me to hit? And open input on it.
Say it again?
I said I am open to input on it, and
Oh,
I'd
yeah.
love to hear if others approach it in a different way, so that we can learn from one another.
That's great. And then if anyone has questions or other ideas that they want to jump in and share, that would be appreciated as well. I think just some of the basic guidelines, just to revisit them again, are that we're encouraging for commissioners to pair up, and one could take the lead in terms of providing access to maybe your community of stakeholders or folks that you work with or in your industry, and then we would hope that it could be paired with another commissioner who may not otherwise have a way of accessing that world traditionally in their normal work. They're not required to be publicly noticed and publicly accessible. And then, so part of that is also that it's really important that there's no more than 2 commissioners. So we want 2 commissioners, no less than 2, hopefully, and definitely no more than 2. And I think that's the main things, right? This should be in another slide deck. But aren't there slides for this?
Yeah, I think there are. There might be that. I'm not quite sure of that.
I think that's the end of the day.
Can I actually
On the front end.
say something about the deep dive? And I really appreciate Roy asking about Hollywood, and why I think it's going to be an interesting and worthwhile deep dive is because so many of the solutions we've been talking about here are relevant there. So for example, as Roy said, it's highly unionized, so collective bargaining is one of the solutions we're trying to promote here. 2, we have a tax credit here in California for Hollywood that, like ETP, people only get money at the end after the work has been performed. And 3, we just saw a slide about portable benefits. People in the entertainment industries literally do gig work, but it's based around W-2 employment, where many of the employers are actually going through a payroll agency, and workers accrue benefits. They stay with the worker. So it's a good deep dive to be able to flesh out some of the policy solutions that we've been talking about that may apply to other industries.
Oh, great.
We should move on.
Sorry?
Okay.
Maria and I are going to do, we're going to actually not do it in person. We're going to do a call-in, and that's going to be with social enterprises in California that employ people coming out of incarceration and homelessness
Great.
and related companies that provide training and support to those individuals and help them move on into the mainstream. And we'll run a format very similar, so a little bit of material, some framing, and then some questions. We'll take notes and bring it back. And then I know John has another one in mind.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think the approach that Commissioner Javits and I want to take with the issue of tax policy as an interest sector, so many of the conversations we've been having relate to either the distributional effects of tax policy or the incentivizing effects of tax policy. And we actually have a lot of expert researchers here in California who are very knowledgeable about this. And so we're going to conduct over the next couple of months a roundtable discussion with some of those researchers and others as may be relevant, and we will be happy to report back as we progress.
So I have a
one
question
of the
about
things-
we'll be doing, one of the things we'll be doing at the following convenings will be to hear insights from the stakeholder convenings that you've done, which will be really exciting. We have something else planned for this afternoon, which I'd like to move us into to give you time to have conversations with each other so that we can learn from each of you about this problem categories document.
Sorry,
which-
Lynn, before we move into
Yeah.
that, can
I
I
have a
ask a
question.
question on the process that we
Yeah, I had a
saw
question
so
as
far?
Sure.
Okay. It strikes me that first of all, it's wonderful to have that structured database. I think it's exciting to be able to look at it. I see how that will get us to a robust conversation about stack ranking different solutions and what might we propose. The piece about crafting a story for how this all fits together and why we're doing it. What is the right way? Do we know how to understand how that might unfold? And just speaking as one commission member, I'd love to see at some point for us to have something to react to that's been put together, by somebody around the table or by staff, because I feel like if it just devolves into it, a laundry list has the risk of devolving into a laundry list. And I would love for us to do more.
I'm just going to say we are doing more.
Yeah.
And we'll come back to you with that.
Great.
Yes.
Great.
Yeah, I think that we're sort of trying to share and reiterate and recap the work plan, and it's an evolving work plan. But thanks for that question. So what we wanted to do today was basically.
I have a question just around the stakeholder discussions.
Okay.
So I know it's no more than 2 commissioners, but some, another staff member from my organization could participate. Right? Okay. I just wanted to sort of clarify that we can be involved in the other stakeholder conversations, just not the commissioner specifically.
Okay, that's not true. Julie's saying.
I thought you meant your staff person on your event.
No, I meant for example, I think we would want to participate on the Hollywood event.
Let me put it this way. Yes, and then we would publicly notice that event.
Even if it's not me.
Yes, correct.
Oh,
So-
it's good I asked.
And sorry, does publicly noticing an event mean that the contents of the event are also open to the public? And then at that point, we might as well have more than 2 commissioners if others want to attend. So that seems like something worth discussing. That seems like a bright line to
Okay,
consider.
that's
Okay.
good to clarify.
And
Yeah.
I believe that on mall, you're going to be collecting, we would love commissioners, as you're planning these, to let on mall know so that we can track them, make sure everyone knows, and then also hear from you at the convenings when we come next time. Thank you.
Okay.
All right, so.
I'm
You
sorry,
have-
one more question on that. What if there's enough interest from the commissioners that we should make it a publicly noticed event and open it to the public and make it subject to the Brown Act and,
Absolutely your prerogative.
okay.
Any other questions? Okay, great. This is sort of what we have the rest of the day to focus on this document. It's called Problem Categories. It should be in your packet. And Anmal's going to kind of remind us of what this document is and then set us up for a series of 2 small group conversations where we're going to ask you to reflect on the items in that document, as well as if some solutions start to emerge from your conversations, to capture those as well. You'll have a note taker with you taking notes, and really we want this to be a chance to have a bit more in-depth, substantive conversations of the type that you can't have when you have 20 people sitting around a table. So Anmal, can you just quickly take us through what this document is?
Yeah, absolutely. So this should be pretty quick as well. As you'll remember, last time we started with an initial list of potential topics that was based on the previous convenings and conversations with the commission around the substantive topics that had been identified as potential areas that that could be considered problem categories or key elements of a scope of work for the commission, or topics or issues that the commission wanted to explicitly delineate as within the scope of what you are looking to solve for in California. And there's a robust conversation and then discussion for all the afternoon session in the previous convening in November. Our sense is that there's generally actually a lot of agreement around around the core content of that earlier, wasn't a draft, it was more initial content, right? And so we've taken and suggestions for new things to add, things to refine, other input was provided there. And so collectively with the Gov team, we've put together an initial working draft of a grouping of those topics, and maybe a couple have been added or refined a bit, and I can talk through that again really quickly. And this is sort of the beginnings of a draft of a problem statement, which the idea would be for us to go through in more depth and more detail today, and to hopefully be able to adopt in January. And then, as Lynn mentioned, the clusters, we'll do this in two parts for group exercises and a third part collectively, dividing these 10 topic areas that are in the document that you have in front of you. And so we've put them into 3 clusters. They're not exactly in the same order of the document itself. The document itself is organized a little bit more in terms of a time horizon from more immediate conditions or problems to more future-looking ones. But for the purposes of this exercise, we basically put the first 4 together, and then this number 7 through 10 will be in the second part, and then we'll come back to number 5 and 6 in the last session. I think that's all we need to know for that, right?
Have these changed materially from the last time we looked at them? Just curious if we're rereading for change or just, largely the restatement of what we had before.
There's largely a restatement because the comments from everybody was that these seem largely correct. I know there are, a few people commented that there were things that were missing, and those have been included, and others about things that we could dig deeper on, which we also tried to include. But much of today will be spent making sure that we've gone as deep as you feel like we need to go in defining. Okay, yeah. So we're going to spend the next 30 minutes, right? 20 minutes for each group to have this discussion now. And on the first, the cluster, right, which is the challenges of inequity and job quality, a topic that has resonated throughout the beginning of this commission in September. So really what we just want to make sure is that what's in there reflects your sense of the problem. And the question is, what's missing in that description that will allow us to move towards solutions when we start to move towards solutions, right? So it's not what's missing in general. There are whole research papers and books written about these problems. But what do you need to see on there so that the statement of the problems and challenges is consistent with your feeling about them, and also will help us better define what we need to address when we get to the solution conversation. Okay, so please go. So it's small group. So.
full way to
About
state the
framing.
challenge report.
We would frame it, I think we're
Yeah.
saying we want it framed around, maybe you'd say, we want the challenges framed around the opportunity rather than challenges and the anomalies within the,
And we'd like it to be done in a way that's unique to California. Sorry, did I interrupt you, Betty? That has novel facts
Yes.
that are, oh, whoops.
Hello, everybody. Hello. Sorry to interrupt just briefly in these great conversations. Take the next couple of minutes to kind of focus, what is it that you want to share back to the rest of the group? And you'll have, 4 or 5 minutes each group. So think about what it is that really is rising to the top that you want the rest of us to hear. Thanks. Okay, everybody. Hopefully, I trust each of your conversations was as rich and generative as the one that we had here. Thank you so much, commissioners. The way we're going to do this is each group will have 5 minutes, and I'm going to put on a little timer. I'll give Julie a chance to respond to if there's anything she wants to ask a clarifying question on. And then we'll have a short break. And then we'll do another round of this for the second large cluster of topics. And I know we've got some different printed things floating around, but the questions we're really going to be focusing on are the ones that are up here. Does this reflect your sense of the challenges? What's missing? And what, if any, solutions came up? And we'll be doing that again for the cluster 2, which is going to be new opportunities and challenges in the future of work. So that's where we're heading right after this. But let's start with, can we start with this group in the corner? And let's hear what you guys have to say.
Great. So we talked about a lot of things. One thing that did seem to keep resurfacing was, sure. Nobody's ever said that to me before. That's nice. We talked a lot about the kind of tension or difference between regulation and incentives. In other words, that if we want to move employers, what should we be thinking about? Regulation and incentives. I mentioned that from our conversation earlier with Abel Valenzuela and Manuel Pastor, that I brought up the fact that at least for us, raising the minimum wage without addressing racial inequality further increased racial disparity. And when you look at that, that's because minimum wage has been a regulation. It's a requirement. Whereas all of the policies we've thought about with regard to racial inequality have not been. They've been incentives or programs or workforce development. There's been no regulation with regard to racial disparity, and that differentiation has furthered racial disparity. And I didn't really see anything like that that was missing. But we also talked about how not whether you're doing regulation or penalty or versus incentives, neither have to be anti-innovation. That there's this argument that somehow these things will destroy innovation, but neither have to be. We talked about what kinds of tax policies, whether the regulation or incentive, could help move employers, help move the needle on inequality. And we lifted up the current proposal in the Senate that's kind of pending to tax employers more for their if their CEO to worker pay ratio is too high. But Dr. Coley kept bringing up there might be other tax code issues that we could look at, that we could examine, that could either be, again, regulation or incentive to help reduce inequality. We talked a lot about how transportation and housing are very serious issues, and we know they're in a separate cluster, but we think that's actually a problem, because if we're addressing transportation and housing separately from the inequality issues in cluster 1, that's kind of why they're not in a coordinated way really being figured out together, and that furthers disparity. We also talked about how educational access, which is, I know, also in a separate cluster, ties to these issues. And so perhaps what we need to do is understand these are separate clusters, but be very clear that these issues are intersectional and must be thought of in coordination with each other. We talked about how for many policies, one size can't fit all, that there needs to be perhaps different policies for different sectors and sizes of employers. We also talked about, with regard to technology, how data ownership creates greater inequality. But it did seem to be like overarching over all of this, there does need to be both regulation and incentive, and we can't rely entirely on incentive or entirely on regulation. And we need to really emphasize, look at what's working and scale it up, because there is stuff working in California. Let's identify it and scale it up. Did I miss anything else?
How about we just go around the table then?
I'll start, but I invite my colleagues because I'm sure I'll miss something. We had a wide-ranging discussion, and so I'm not sure we came right to the nub of things. But we do think from the first question, does this reflect your sense of the challenges and problems? Yes, it does. We saw an overlap between 1 and 3 in terms of inequality. I don't know if the rest of you felt that same thing, but yes, it does. And the question is really what is missing. Number one, we thought the issue of monopsonies and concentration was not mentioned here. And that bill that you were talking about, Saru, is sort of one potential solution, but how do you get at that? We also noted that the final panel that was up here, the small business voice, for example, and the challenges that they are experiencing are the flip side of the coin, and that you can't really talk about just what the workers are experiencing without talking about how small businesses are challenged as well. Not the big businesses, but the small ones. Obviously, we have to figure out a policy way to raise the floor in order to address inequality. And what do you do? For example, I mean, Mariana represents, workers who don't have a big employer. They're all these small employers, and a lot of them may be minimum wage workers themselves who need an at-home caregiver. And so they may not be able to afford paying a wage that they aren't even earning themselves. So how do you subsidize the bottom to be able to address this oncoming onslaught of aging workers, of aging employees, of aging people in California and their care as well? And then we did talk about a couple of solutions just briefly. One, I do think that we've got to look at data as labor. I think that is a revenue stream. The AI and the platform economy has exacerbated inequality, and so we should look to them. I think since you are all suppliers of your data to these companies that are making billions off of you, perhaps they should do a little revenue sharing, and especially if we direct some of that to the folks, or the bulk of that to the folks who really need income enhancement, that would be one solution we should take a look at. And then what else am I missing? Did I get it all? I think I got it all.
Yeah, we also had a wide-ranging conversation. If you guys want to chip in on this, I think there were kind of two sections of our conversation. The first one was more about framing the problem overall, and we actually looked before these 4 categories at the opening statement that was made, and we thought that it overemphasized, for example, technology, and instead of emphasizing many of the other structural issues we've talked about. But at a higher level, I think generally around kind of talking about the problem, we just felt like this report should be new, fresh, provocative, optimistic, California specific, and that reading this right now, it reads like the current state of work, not the future state of work. And it's stating the problems in a little bit of a stale way that isn't really reflective of the powerful data points and insights we've had here, and we need something that's more provocative, more fresh, and also makes an argument. Several people commented equity, for example, is not something that people universally agree on as a value in California. And so if we're going to make a case for our recommendations, the problem statement has to make it convincing, like it's $1 trillion to the economy if we don't include people, or whatever that may be. So that was a whole cluster of discussion. And then more specific discussion was, again, that it seemed like we have to really lean in here on the future. And Roy, for example, said, if we read this 20 years from now, did we miss something big, or, did we? So we thought there needs to be more emphasis on these issues of race, gender, geography, monopsony, consolidation of wealth, aging. We thought that's a much broader area. That's not just about the caregiver economy. That's about a whole different economy when people are working longer, et cetera. and then the lack of a culture of respect for low-wage workers and what that's done to us. And certainly we talked about the need to raise the floor as well as raise the skill level. Anything, did I miss anything? Something, yeah.
Just on the optimism in California specific and looking to the future, we talked about, we have the largest container port in the country. We have the UC system. We're the largest agricultural state. We're the largest dairy state. We have Silicon Valley. We have all of these assets here. And this doesn't talk about what we have and how we protect and expand those. And Roy made this point about 20 years. 20 years ago, when our labor secretary was organizing workers in the garment industry in Los Angeles, nobody would have said that industry would be gone. I said no Teamster would have said 20 years ago or 30 years ago when we had 100,000 Latino food processing members earning middle-class wages in the Central Valley, that we'd be down to 12,000 now because globalization and automation had wiped that work out. So how do we protect the assets and to be a little bit more aspirational about using what we have and making the Golden State gold for everybody again and not bronze or a lump of coal or whatever you want to say. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I like these clusters because it's interesting to see the different direction that the conversations go, but there's also obviously a lot of common links too. And so we generally felt that these different categories reflect the sense, the challenges, the problems. We did think that there were some things missing or that could be accentuated. And one goes to kind of what you were talking about in terms of the statement of the problem. And so we had three things that came up. One was being more explicit when we name the problem and the demographics, especially as it applies to race and gender and generational inequality, that we've gotten at pretty much every convening, we've gotten presentations on how bad the numbers are. Today, we got it from two of these great professors, but it's not the first time you've heard it. It won't be the last. So I think being more explicit and intentional in the language as to what the scope of the problem is and how severe it is, again, especially we felt as it applied to race and gender and the generational inequality that's not always reflected in a snapshot of data points. The other thing speaks to enforcement that we thought was something that was missing. We even talked about potentially having it as a separate number category, but feel that it could probably go into number 4, into empowering workers' voices. But that enforcement is something that is it's an enormous challenge, especially for a state like ours with the various economies we have. And Doug was talking about all the different assets we have. That also provides a lot of challenges in terms of enforcing, whether it's labor laws or whether it's those that are doing union busting, whatever it might be. I think that that's a unique challenge that we have to understand and ultimately figure out what the best solutions are. Understanding that it's challenging to do simply a top-down approach, that incorporating local involvement has its own challenges, but is probably necessary as well to ensure that all workers are protected in every corner of our state. And the third one was something that could kind of balance between 2 and 4 are obstacles for collective action due to outsourcing, new employment models, the fissuring of the relationship between workers and their employer. Workers are more disconnected from ultimate economic decision makers. And so it makes it much more difficult for collective action, whether it's through a union or not. The idea of having the ability to bring in the collective voice of workers empowers those workers and allows them the ability to be able to have more productive work lives. And that's something that is a absolute challenge going forward as well, especially with these different economic models or an expansion of the same old kind of issues regarding misclassification or taking advantage of workers. In this global economy, it's more and more challenging to know who the boss is, right? And who that person is that actually you go to you make your plea. And so that's something that's also a challenge. Anything else? We're good? Yeah, so thank you all.
Okay, now that we're in the swing of it, we're going to go through to the next cluster, cluster 2, and we'll take a break after that. And on-mall is going to help us just kind of focus on what, if you want to change the slide, we have a slide up here too. Just to kind of remind us what's in the cluster, and then we'll be ready to have our conversation. Thanks.
Sounds good. So this second cluster, again, it's a little bit out of order from the main problem categories document. We're looking at the what are numbered 7, 8, 9, and 10. In that cluster, we've described as new opportunities and challenges in the future of work. So quickly, these are supporting displaced workers in transition. It's partly a response to the fears of widespread job loss, or any transitions that do actually end up happening as a result of technological change and other shifts in the labor market as well. The second one is safely enable technology, but also protect workers in a data-driven future. I think some of that came up in the previous conversation, so hopefully there'll be space to delve a little bit deeper into that. Build skills to prepare for the jobs of the future, was touched on a few times in the previous convening as well. And the last of this cluster is to make the most of California's innovation. That California is a leader in innovation and development of both technology and other industries as well. And thinking about how, if the focus is on technology, how technology may be used to actually improve the quality of jobs or improve wages, not only be seen as a potential threat to jobs, job quality, and maybe a source of job displacement. But then, of course, also going beyond technology as well. California, as someone mentioned, has a lot of strengths, so that's something to build on. And let's see how that we can make that work for all Californians.
How about take 1 or 2 minutes to summarize? Take 1 or 2 minutes to summarize and get ready to share back. Okay? Okay. Let's do the opposite. Maybe we can start with this group this time, since, everybody ready? Y'all ready? Okay,
Well, let me
please.
go ahead and get started on this. We had lots of great conversations. I'm going to rely on my fellow commissioners here, make sure I captured everything. One of the things that we talked about is that it would be great in framing these questions that we have here, that we have the opportunity to look at maybe what are some global solutions, global challenges, look at California being such an international region that it is, state that it is, that, our peers are probably other countries that are out there that are really ahead in how they're addressing some of these challenges. So I think that's a theme that came up that's probably worth exploring. And I know we talked about the database, maybe, including some information related to that. We talked about the fact that we are in a labor shortage in various industry sectors, and that creates an opportunity for workers to be empowered and to find solutions and to be able to know that they can stand on good footing. We referenced a lot of the comments that were made in the earlier panel about, the opportunities for workers along the lines of, some of the benefits that they could achieve through, work, because basically they would be in a good position for, given the fact that there is employers are always looking for, workers and skilled workers. So you can jump in on that if I missed that. We talked about a lot of the benefits in automation and AI, for example. The technologies that create a lot of what we're seeing today and growth in those sectors come from through publicly funded institutions many times. And how do we figure out a way to create that benefit that is being achieved back into the system that first allowed it to be created? So we thought we had a lot of conversation around that and thought that that would be a real unique way to look at technology from that perspective. We also talked about workers in terms of generational and gender. And in terms of this topic, one of the things that was brought up about the transfer of wealth, a lot of businesses that have been grown, and there's family-owned businesses, and sometimes the children do not want to carry it forward, so that there's an opportunity there to really look at what are some of the ways that we could contain that and redistribute that, maybe not within the family structure, but possibly within the workers. I think you mentioned a co-op type opportunities could be explored, and we could build that into this. I'm going to say, did I capture everything?
Yeah, I think just the one other. Sure. One other thing I think, and we were all over the map a little bit here. But, with regard to number 8, we talked about the sort of critical sort of whole area of data and who controls data, who gets to see data, and so forth. It could be that there is some dramatic technological innovation and everything becomes automated, and then we have a serious problem of how we distribute all of the surplus that's generated, and that's a good problem to have, and I'm sure we're up to the challenge. But frankly, a more likely scenario is we continue to have technologies developed in such a way that actually increases power over workers, right? Increases the ability to surveil work, increases data collection on the work process itself, and even allows the owners of those technologies to not pay workers for continuous time, but to identify discrete moments within a work process to pay piece rate compensation for. And we already see that happening all around us, obviously. So the question of who controls this data, who has transparency into the algorithms and gets to ensure the algorithms are being done in an equitable way. Obviously, if you have a lower income person, their reservation wage, the price at which they might be willing to accept a task may be lower than somebody who has other resources. This could magnify inequality if we don't make sure it doesn't.
Great, thank you. How about Sure. Hello. So this cluster, actually, we felt that it was missing an entire bullet or number. So I would say it has to be number 11, which is that what I don't see in any of these is really protecting workers and the state of California against basically regression on labor standards back to where we used to be in the name of innovation and the future of work. And the big example that I gave was that at emancipation of slavery, the Restaurant Association demanded the right to hire newly freed slaves and not pay them anything, which is the source of a sub-minimum wage for tipped workers, which exists in 43 states, which is currently $2.13 at the federal level. California got rid of that sub-minimum wage 50 years ago. And here we are now with Instacart and DoorDash demanding the right to cut their workers' payments based on how much they're tipped, which is essentially exactly the same argument that was made at emancipation, that tips should replace wages. And the same argument that was gotten rid of 50 years ago in California when we as a state said, no, we will not allow tips to replace wages. And this is not, I'm giving one example. Obviously, there are many examples. I think you gave another. There are many examples in which, in the name of innovation and changing nature of work, we're actually allowing the companies in the state to regress back to things that we had already decided on as a state we are not going to allow. And so we need a number 11 that makes sure that we don't regress on these issues, especially, frankly, when the rest of the country is moving forward on these issues. The House just passed a bill to get rid of that sub-minimum wage for tipped workers. And here we are in California in some of these companies going backwards while the rest of the country is going forward. And so we just can't allow that to happen. A lot of these things are old sheep in new wolf's clothing. Or I'm sorry, I'm bad with metaphors, but old wolves in new sheep's clothing. And then on the other hand, Feifei brought up that we also need to, of course, uplift what's good and scale up what's good. California really can be a source of true innovation. We need to be, and a lab, we need to be doing research and policy as to what's good and scale it up in terms of technology and the future of work. I gave the example of Sweetgreens that we've been working with that has been thinking about how to use an app or an iPad that would allow individual workers in the restaurant to understand their responsibilities and role within an entire workflow of a restaurant, and then actually have input, make changes, be more productive, and figure out themselves how to be more productive and how to move up ladders. So there are ways in which technology could be used to improve working conditions, and that's one example that those are the kinds of things that need to be researched and scaled up. Feifei also brought up the need to really add immigration, which we don't see anywhere, as a real challenge issue, and definitely a challenge, also an opportunity in that it's one of the few issues in which both high wage and low wage workers, especially in this future of work world, are coming together and suffering in many ways alike. Then we learned a lot from Feifei about getting to the bottom of data ownership, access, and data dividends. Illinois has a bill that would actually allow us to protect identity, people's facial identity and privacy. Do you want to say more about that?
Well, actually, it's a little more nuanced. It's just many states are now in this new era experimenting with what does it mean to protect a person's data. Privacy is one aspect. Of course, there's a lot more economically, the value of data. We talked a lot, but in this particular case of Illinois, there's now active lawsuit between residents of Illinois with the large companies actually not headquartered in Illinois, but using biometric data of Illinois residents, such as face pictures or fingerprints. And the active lawsuit is really bringing out the new era of issues of companies, global companies, using user data and challenging privacy and data value issues. So other states are looking at this, and we just talked about this in the context of what California should prepare for, and also actually should get ahead and be a leader in this.
And then the last piece was just infrastructure, that if we're going to be thinking about the future of work, we need to have the data infrastructure, other kinds of infrastructure to make it happen. And one example is making sure broadband is accessible to all.
Great. Thank you. And we'll switch it up a little bit and go over here to this group.
Last time that group had all of our points, so let's see. We were eavesdropping on you. So we started first with number 9 here and felt like this statement needs to be much stronger. And starting out by saying that our workforce development system is broken, that if we were going to think about how to set up a rational workforce development system that offers people lifelong learning and matches them to employment, this is not the system we would set up. So let's just start with that statement. Secondly, and I'm not sure which bullet this fits under, but we in California have tremendous assets that we can leverage, whether it's our government budget, the private sector, the philanthropy world, which is supporting this effort. There are a lot of assets that we have that we can invest in creating good jobs. And so that needs to be there as an opportunity. On number 7, we also felt like it was important to say that in this day and age, displacement is now the norm. Whether that's displacement from technology, and we thought climate change is missing from that because climate change is going to displace workers, or by the very fact that the social compact is breaking down and people don't stay at the same job their whole life, that if we start out with the premise that displacement is the norm, then we can start to train people to deal with that. And then finally, on the last point, and this is on number 8, and other folks mentioned this, that really, unchecked, absent government action, that technology could lead to increased inequities and inequality. Did I miss anything?
I think my only addition is that in the categories of work in which we could invest, I think there's a story about what we think the society that we want to live in might look like, and more of an attitude of optimism and extending our lead. And so in addition to climate change being a source of displacement, it's also can be a source of employment. But then care work, scientific research. Yeah. I actually just leaned over and was like, no, we got to sneak this in before those guys say it. But I think that this commission, in as much as we want to address all of the issues in the present and anticipate how those might be exacerbated and address that direction as well, we have to have a proactive point of view about the future we want to see and put in place the measures necessary to have California be a winning place to live and work in that future.
Everything they said. There were a lot of similarities, so I'll eliminate those and maybe we can focus in on the ones that where we're different. We started off on 9 in light of today's convening, where there's been a lot of talk about training and appropriateness and the partnership between the private sector, employers and employees. We circled in on the ETP. There's maybe some mystery with this group and maybe even with the public about what the employment training panel does and how it does it, how it's funded. We don't have time to dive all the way into that, but what I can tell you, it's underfunded and underutilized and should be expanded so that more California workers and employers can have opportunity to train their employee base for the future, which after all is what this is about. The challenge though within that is no one size fits all. So a training program that may work for Pamela Khan's operation may not be the same that will work for Mariana's constituency. It may not, it won't be the same. So trying to reconcile how we can have a large government program that works for all the various sectors within an economy. And within that space, we got into the portability of benefits and other things that an employee can take with them wherever they happen to go. And the governor mentioned that there's got to be a platform that can be discovered that makes that easier, not only for the employee, but also for employers. And I would imagine the employer community would embrace something like that if it simplifies what they do. Many of us in here are small business people. I have a small business of 11 employees. It is not easy running a small business in the state of California. It is not. And I've learned that very quickly. The data issue we did get into as well. When you're on the job, there are a lot of things being tracked, namely how many widgets are coming through the machine that you're operating on, and making sure that that doesn't become a surveil situation, but rather data that can be helped to drive the process and the efficiency of the operation. So that's a subtle requirement that needs to be done. We did talk about climate because it hasn't really featured in much of the rest of the work of the commission. Although I think it came up at convening number 2. That's something that needs to be present in a lot of what we do, particularly because this is the one about the future of work. And as we know, the future is now, and we're dealing with a lot of those issues right now. But it doesn't feature prominently enough, I suppose. And I think there's agreement with the previous group enough in the problem statement for what we're doing here. I'll add at the end an issue I tried to bring up earlier today. The scale of California, I think we're all still trying to comprehend what that means. And I'll use the comparison with the Chinese economy. I will venture 99.9% of Americans can't comprehend the scale of the size of the China economy. You just can't. Back that up a little bit. The California economy is so large that the 40 million people that are here can't even comprehend it. So once we get a better handle on what that means, I think it'll help lead the direction that we go in the future. And then Governor Granholm had a great solution or offer, a grand challenge that if the governor would identify 2 or 3 things that say, I challenge California to do X, and we all have skin in the game and let's get it done. Not 20 things, not just one thing, a few things to really rise up for what we all stand for here in California. I think that would be a nice enabler to really move the ball forward. And thank you for that suggestion.
Just to be clear about this, when I say challenge, I'm talking about challenging, for example, the tech community to come up with a solution to the portable benefits issue or to the streamlining of regulations issue. Challenge the foundation community to band together to help fund something. Challenge cities to do something, and they get rewarded. It's not just a verbal, you get a reward in some way, shape, or form. A group would have to do a sort of hackathon, a social hackathon, to figure out, it could be this, it could be another group, but a series of grand challenges that are not too many that the governor could, and again, I'm so governor-centric, would stand up at the state of the state and say, I'm announcing Governor Newsom's grand challenge, whatever it is. So.
But Governor, you are governor-centric, and I so appreciate having you here because we talked about imagining the future. And we mentioned the fact that at one point Detroit was the 5th largest city in the country, that it had one of the most important industries in the United States, which was entirely unionized and created middle-class jobs for generations of workers. And nobody would have imagined, I think people probably took Detroit for granted that this was going to continue. And none of us wants to be sitting here 30 years from now saying California, no disrespect intended, became Detroit. So to have you here and to be able to share the experiences of your state and the hindsight to tell us what Michigan could have or should have done differently. Thank you.
Quickly before we break, is there anything that you'd like to add, Julie, about just the document itself, about before we move into our final kind of whole group conversation?
The next piece, the third cluster, we're going to talk about work adjacent issues, but as a whole group. And I just wanted to note the draft that you have broke all of the 10 buckets into 3 clusters. That was not presented in the last document, and it's not necessarily even how we're suggesting it be presented. That was purely for conversational purposes. So what we're going to do, unless there's a strong push otherwise, is to continue to list the problems in a list of 10 or more, depending on the outcomes of these conversations.
Thanks. I think it worked as a conversational structure. Yes. I think it worked really well. Great. Let's take a 15-minute break. We'll come back for our final discussion of the last 2 topics, as well as any final reflections. Thanks.